I want to expand people's view of what human being is. I want people to see the world for how it really is. That's what matters to me. Hi, so my name is Evie. I have what's known as an intersex condition, also known as a disorder of sex development, which means that instead of my body being strictly male or female, it's actually both. The specific condition I've got is called gonadal dysgenesis, which means that my ovaries didn't develop as purely ovaries. They developed as both ovaries and testicles. So I have a prostate, but I also have a womb. And when I was born, my genitals were kind of a mismatch of male and female, and I later on had corrective surgery to fix that. So what being intersex basically means for my everyday life is I have to take medication every day, specifically what's known as hormone replacement therapy. So I take estrogen every single day, and for half of a month every month I also take progesterone alongside it. This is so I can have a period each month. Without it, I tend to get breakthrough bleeds, and it's not super fun or predictable, so it's kind of a necessary evil. Yeah, that's a general rundown. So in terms of gender identity, which is something a lot of intersex people struggle with, there's a lot of confusion surrounding what we should identify as, what fits us best, and a lot of this comes from other people trying to fit us into a normal box of male or female. So I identify as non-binary, so I don't mind if people call me by male pronouns, female pronouns. The only running theme is femme, but that wasn't always the case. For a very, very long time, I identified quite strictly as female. However, I was raised as male by my parents, which caused a lot of problems when it came to me realizing that I'm non-binary, because it felt like a betrayal of this journey I'd been on for so long. The thing I found with being intersex is people's general reaction, personally, when they find out, at least in my experience, has been good. People are usually just generally interested, or if they're not interested in, say, the specifics of it, they're more just passively like, hey, that's cool. And I honestly think that is kind of a new thing. If we were 10, 20 years ago, immediately I'd be labeled as a freak and completely ignored. Now, for some people who, when they find out I'm intersex, they do think I'm a freak. They feel uncomfortable by it. I think that's because I represent what is essentially living evidence of someone who doesn't fit a binary. It kind of breaks down the idea of male and female when you have someone who, not just in terms of their gender identity, but also their body, doesn't fit in either of those boxes. So the reason I'm doing this video is essentially to raise awareness, because I feel there are so many people who don't even know intersex is a thing, despite it existing as long as humans have. People don't know about it. People aren't taught about it. People like me might as well not exist to a lot of people. That's how little they know about us. But we do exist. We're all around you, and raising awareness of that is important. And I think raising awareness of this isn't just going to help people who are intersex, but also people who are trans. When we have physical evidence of sex not being binary, that's a lot harder for people to hand wave away. Gender identity is just as solid as sex, but so many people ignore it. They sweep it under the rug, they say it's all in your head, and I've been through that. Yet with intersex, they can't do that. And the question then arises, if someone's physical body isn't strictly male or female, then why can't their brain, the most complex organ in the body, why can't that not be strictly male or female either? So that's what I want to aim to do, is just educate people. I want to help you understand. I hope maybe this will reach some people who are intersex, or people who are questioning if they're intersex. So my story really begins, well, obviously at my birth, but especially in this case. So I was born with the only obvious sign of my intersex condition being my genitalia being deformed. They appeared somewhere in between male and female. So the best way I can describe it is essentially if you took female genitalia and male genitalia and you had a slider, like in a game, and you pulled the slider closer to the middle, but still a bit more towards female, that's essentially what I had. Everything was sealed shut, but it was obviously not male or female. So despite my genitalia being obviously not what would be considered normal, my parents never really told me about it. They refused to bring it up. Every time I had questions about it, they would just hard avoid it, which at first I thought was just a them thing, but it turns out this is normal for pretty much anyone with an intersex condition. Their parents will hide it from them, and not only that, but doctors will too. So there are cases of so many doctors in pretty much any country in the world where when an intersex child is born, their first thought is, we need to correct their genitals immediately. They don't care what gender the child will grow up as. They don't care what makes the child comfortable. They don't care about any of that. The only thing they care about is having a normal kid. That's the only thing they care about. So intersex children are generally lied to, even if they've had a surgery when they were a kid. Thankfully, I didn't have any surgery when I was a child. And I think if I had, it probably would have been disastrous, because surgery standards in the 90s for that kind of thing, not great. The story of my intersex condition is obviously interwoven with my gender identity. And at first, I thought I was just biological male. But I noticed as time went on, I started to gravitate towards female things, play with toys meant for girls, all that. And I remember specifically one of the inciting instances for that. I was in primary school at the time, which is what we call elementary school in the UK. Essentially, what had happened is there'd been this big rainstorm and I got completely soaked. And so I went back in, sat down, and a teacher came up to me and said, "Hey, do you want some new clothes? We've got a whole bunch of spare clothes you can throw on." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So she wheels out this big bin of clothes and, it has male clothes, female clothes. And I said, "Can I have any of these?" And she said, "Yeah, whatever you want. I don't mind." And I really wish at that point I would have gone and picked up some girl clothes and started at that point, because perhaps that way something would have been done sooner, someone would have noticed. But I think sadly, I know that nothing would have been done because my parents wouldn't have cared either way. So the next major event that happened in primary school or elementary school is around what we would call year 5, which is the year just before you leave. Now, I'd hated physical education for such a long time. PE was my least favorite subject. But one day, I was doing my usual routine of avoiding physical education by wandering the school. And I came across where the girls were doing PE. I went out and just sat there, and I was planning to just go back inside and keep wandering around. But one of the teachers said, "Oh, you could join in if you want," which blew my mind. I was like, what? I can just do that? Like, can I just change which class I'm in like that? That's crazy. So I joined in. I can't remember what we played exactly. I think it was netball, kind of like volleyball, but not. So after that incident, my teacher of my class, who was also the head of physical education, he found out about that and he did not like it. So the school I went to was quite heavily religious. Despite that, most of the teachers were fine. They were quite open and supportive. But this one teacher hated me. He made it his absolute mission to make my life at that primary school absolutely miserable. He would ignore my questions in class, be really aggressive towards me. And this is all because I happened to go and play a game outside with other girls. That was it. That's all it was. So that kind of came to a head after a rather stupid incident. I had essentially written a silly note to another person in class, just kind of back and forth, like swearing because, oh my God, that's so cool when you're a kid. And I got in trouble for that. Now, normally you'd think someone would just say, "Hey, don't do that. It's fine, done." Nah, this guy was like, "Okay, you have to go to the headmaster's office and I'll be there and I'll explain what's happened." He shows up and he's going crazy on this. So the headmaster then starts also shouting and screaming at me saying, "Oh, we know you did it. Like, that's not okay. You can't do that. You can't keep treating the school however you want." That kind of devastated me because that was one of the first times I had people who were supposed to be authority figures outside of my family treat me in a terrible way. And that, combined with how I was treated at home, which was pretty poorly, started to make me lose faith in people generally. So that thankfully didn't last too long. By the time I got to my last year, things had calmed down and it got a lot better near the end. So when I got into high school, things were so much worse. The teachers weren't great, but they weren't really as bad as my primary school teachers. The issue was the other students. Up until this point, they'd been relatively innocent, open-minded, caring, but the second we got into secondary school, that completely changed. People who I considered close friends would ignore me. People who I didn't really know would try and get to know me, only to ask me 100 questions about my gender and my genitalia, because at this point, even I didn't know I had a DSD. It was becoming increasingly obvious. I'm not sure, 13, 14, and I looked really femme, and I started to have some like breast budding happen. So everyone was convinced that I was either female to male and wanting to be a boy because I was going to school as a boy, and other people were convinced that I was just being weird for attention. And it got to the point where I had one kid try to repeatedly pull my clothes down whenever we were doing PE to try and see what my genitals were. Oh god, it was terrible. You have no fucking clue. Anyway, so again, physical education is kind of a recurring theme here. When I was in the locker room changing, people started to notice that I wasn't exactly fitting a male body type. It went from people bullying me to people bullying me and leering at me and wanting to see in a really disgusting, gross way, to the point where people would brush up against me on purpose to try and feel my chest. And that made me feel so uncomfortable. I just stopped going to PE class completely. I just didn't do it anymore. And that continued for essentially all of high school. I just didn't. No matter how many letters I got, I just didn't want to go through that again. A school's somewhere you're supposed to learn and feel safe, not have people constantly sexually assault you. So in the UK, we have something similar to a lot of other countries called SATs, which are supposed to be based on your ability. So if you're doing really well in school, you're in SAT 1. If you're doing not so well, maybe you're in SAT 4 or 5, whatever school's set up. Now, I tended to always be in the higher SAT 1, and I started a few classes at SAT 2 and moved up to SAT 1. And I was really enjoying it. I was really loving learning about science and history and English, and it was fantastic. But the problem came primarily in science class. I had a teacher who considered me to be incredibly disruptive because I would chime in quite often with my response to anything she said, really, that I kind of wanted to point something out. Because my goal at that point was, hey, I want people here to actually learn what the world is like, not just what a particular piece of text says. Because, well, the perfect example is actually to do with chromosomes. So my chromosomes are XY, although they could also be XX. I'll get into that a little later though. But while I didn't know much about DSTs at the time, I did know about trans people. So I knew instinctively that XX doesn't always equal female and XY doesn't always equal male. So when this topic inevitably came up, I spoke my mind and I said, well, what about trans people? She didn't like that. She really didn't like that. And I was placed outside of the set system into what was called a behavioral set, which is a set made up of people from all of the different sets. So set 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it was awful because you have all these different ability levels and the teacher's trying to teach every single one of them at the same time. And you can't do it. So no one's getting a good education. And on top of that, we're essentially being labeled as undesirable by the school and shoved away where we can't raise our voices or ask questions or point things out. And this is another point in my long-running experience of figures of authority not really always deserving that authority. So one of my close friends in high school, he and I would play games together all the time. We would sit down and do really long grinds on MMOs and stuff together. Like, we spent almost every day together. I was so close with him. But, well, when I eventually decided, hey, maybe I'm trans, maybe I should try that. Maybe I should, ask people to call me by a new name and new pronouns. Everyone had responded pretty well, but when I came to him, he didn't want to. He would use so many different excuses and reasons, and it wounded me that despite us being so close, he just wouldn't acknowledge who I am. It was only when his girlfriend stepped in and talked to him that he became slightly more accommodating, but still not great. So my favorite class in high school was actually drama, and the reason for that is because I felt I could escape and, be someone else for a bit, play a different character to me. That helped me get away from the situation I was stuck in. I had an abusive home life. I was bullied constantly at school. Even the teachers didn't care about me. So that was one of my only escapes at school. And I remember one time I was actually selected to play Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. We were going to host a performance of it. And I was like, sure, okay, I'll give that a go. We were allowed to choose our own costumes. And I decided I wanted something not female female, but quite feminine, androgynous. And wearing that on stage in front of all of these people, some of which bullied me, and they couldn't do anything or say anything in that moment, that felt so empowering. And it's one of the few good memories I have from high school. Most of the time with school, I would go home and, well, try to stay out as late as I could to avoid seeing my family. I also escaped constantly into games. Being able to play a female character was so crazily empowering back then. It, again, gave me an escape. And I honestly think the effect that kind of thing has is so understated. So this takes me to about around my mid-teens. I decided I'll come out to my mother because I sure as hell didn't trust my dad. He, well, screamed at me, shouted at me, pinned me against walls, kicked me. Definitely not the best father. So I reached out to my mother, who I'd always been kind of close with in a sort of strained way. And I spent ages trying to figure out how to do this. I just couldn't bring it to myself to say, hey, I'm trans, to her. So instead what I did was I figured, okay, I'll leave her a letter. So I wrote this really long handwritten letter and I left it in her room. And just 2 hours later, I ran in there and grabbed it because I was that afraid. So eventually I figured, and it's kind of not the best way to do this, but I just sent her an email. That's the best I could do. And I waited and waited until the next day she came into my room and said, I've read the message you sent me. And I was like, okay, cool. This is the point where she says, she's going to support me. And she said, I don't agree with it. Which, it's me. Like, it's how I feel. How can you not agree with how I feel? And this became such a massive deal for her. We went on a trip to Florida shortly afterwards, and the whole time she would give me these little jabs of, hey, you better not talk about that. You better not ruin this trip. You'll get over it. Just don't talk about it. And I didn't. But as soon as I got home, I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to go and see someone. I wanted to start taking hormones. And the moment I realized she just didn't want to listen was when she threatened me with calling my dad. She literally said, if you don't stop this, I'll call your father, which scared the shit out of me. This is a man who cracked my ribs out of anger. So I figured I'll just keep quiet. And I regret that. I really regret that. I feel like I was forced into silencing who I am because of someone else's discomfort. So quite early on, I knew I was more attracted to girls than boys, but definitely attracted to both. My condition didn't necessarily impact how I felt in terms of attraction to other people, but how I felt about myself. I felt like I was somehow tainted and broken and that no one would want me. So every time the idea of a lesbian relationship would come up, I'd shut myself down and go, oh, well, people might not consider me to be a real girl. Or, if straight at the time, I suppose, but now it would be gay relationship would come up. My response to that would be, oh, well, they probably don't want to go out with someone who's so feminine. Or they do want to go out with someone who's feminine, but I'm not feminine enough. So it was this constant back and forth, almost like a heightened imposter syndrome. Me constantly doubting myself, how I look. Are my boobs big enough? Is my jawline okay? How's my voice? It just made me question absolutely everything. That's what got in the way of romance for me. Also, kind of in my mid-teens, I started experiencing cramps, really bad cramps. And at first I thought I'd pulled a muscle. Then it happened again. And I thought, okay, well, I've pulled the same muscle again. And this kind of continued until I put two and two together. And I was like, okay, this is happening pretty much on a monthly basis. So that's kind of weird. I went ahead and I looked around online and I learned about DSDs. And that was the first time stuff started to click in my head. I was like, oh, so that's why my junk looks how it does. That's why my body's doing what it does. And that's why I'm having these cramps. So armed with that knowledge, I figured, okay, I'll go and see my GP, my family doctor, basically. So I went to my brother, who lived separately, who was kind of a safe haven for me in my childhood. I used to go to his place quite a lot. He said he'd take me to the GP to see them and explain stuff. So I get there and I say, hey, I'm trans. I want to transition. I'd like to get estrogen, if that's okay. And also, here's this really weird thing that's been happening to me that I think might be an intersex condition. His response was, okay, well, we'll refer you to someone for the trans thing. But intersex conditions are so rare, you probably don't have one, but I'll book an ultrasound anyway. away. That appointment never came because he didn't book it. And I think that was the moment I realized that, hey, even with doctors, I'm not safe. So what do I do now? So the trans appointment I had to see a gender therapist, that one took so long. The thing about the UK is we have two health services, essentially. We have the NHS, which is the National Health Service, and we've got private healthcare. So the NHS is free for everything, anything you can imagine. The downside to that is if it's not something that's like an emergency, the waiting list can be so long. Despite living in a country where most people are pretty pro-trans, you still have to wait a ridiculous time to get treatment, which is crazy. And I was no exception to that. I got sick of waiting and I said, you know what? If they're not going to do it for me, I'll do it myself. I'll sit down, I'll learn everything I can about this, and I'll treat myself. So I went and researched what types of treatment is given to people with DSTs. I researched the type of treatment you get for gender dysphoria, and I figured out kind of a happy medium with that. So I started buying medication online and taking it, and it's one of the best things I ever did, because I don't know what my body would have done if I'd have held off on that. I don't know what my frame would be. I don't know how my anything would be. So I'm glad I started doing that. Later on into my teens, my father found out that I was trans, and he found out because my sister got upset at me. She knew, and she told him to get back at me. The one good thing about that is by the time he'd learned, he was pretty far advanced with cancer. The one good side of that is he wasn't able to physically hurt me anymore. It didn't stop him being verbally abusive and screaming and shouting at me and telling me it was wrong and a mistake and that I wasn't his child because of that. Even though I hated him, it hurt, like my whole life until this point, I just had people push me away again and again and again and again. And to have it happen again, it started to wear on me quite badly. I remember one time near the end of my dad's life, he was in hospital. Me and my sister went to visit him, and he was ranting about me being trans, and he decided that he wanted to put me down on this once and for all, and he started saying really vitriolic things like, oh, you don't look like a girl, and I'm like, well, I mean, a lot of people just call me a girl straight up. And I'll always remember this because we had distant relatives come visit. They kind of weren't able to understand him too clearly. And they came in and said, oh, you're here with your daughters. He hated that. And they did it again when they left. And he was like, you don't look like a girl, though. No one thinks you're a girl. I think that was the biggest I'm not owned he ever did. So my father eventually died from leukemia. And I didn't really know how to feel about that. I felt a mixture of relief, but also grief and a bit of guilt. I was like, hey, was he really that bad though? And I mean, he was, but I'd lost a potential parent, someone who could maybe one day see me for who I am and support me, but that was never who he was. That was who I wanted him to be. It's a shame, but I never would have had the father I wanted, and that's okay. That's okay. So after my father died, I tried coming out as trans again, more generally, and tried getting my mum on board, but she gave me the same response as always. She kept trying to shut me down, and again and again and again. And it got to the point where I was like, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to leave. I'm gone. I told her this. So she went and got my brother. Now, my thought process was, okay, what's my brother? He's been supportive up until now. He took me to the GP to get diagnosed. He, has been supporting me the whole way through, calls me by whatever pronouns I want. This will be fine. He'll just talk some sense into her. And he didn't. He met me outside and pushed me really hard against a metal railing. My back was in so much pain, and I just remember being in complete shock. I felt like for one person that I trusted with everything, had just betrayed me in favor of the man who had tormented me for almost 20 years. That hurt, and I was so determined. So I left. I ran away. I packed up my things. I went over to a friend's house, got them to call a taxi, and I ran away to a friend's house in Manchester. And it was kind of peaceful there. I felt like maybe I'd finally have a fresh start. But my brother managed to track me down. He called me up, we spoke, and he said sorry. It was genuine, and I could tell it had hurt him. And he said, hey, if you want to stay there, that's fine. I won't come and get you. I won't tell anyone where you are. But if you want to come back, I'll take you back. You can leave whenever you want, and I'll have a talk. Because you know what? You're right. She does have to be more understanding. So I thought, okay, cool. I'll go back. I'll see what happens. And she was a bit better for a time, at least. Around my really late teens, sort of 18, 19, I got into freelance 3D art. So I made a whole bunch of stuff, mostly environments at the time, for what was essentially VRChat's predecessor, Second Life. And I made a whole bunch of different things, and I got jobs outside of the platform too. And that was going well, and I figured, okay, you know what? This is a good job. I like making stuff. I like creating things so I can express myself without physically being there. It gave me a shield where I felt protected, essentially, from people being able to scrutinize me myself, which made me feel a lot more comfortable in creating it. Art's been genuinely a life-saving thing for me. Over the last 10 years, I've gone from doing 3D to now doing kind of a multimedia thing, mostly 2D at the moment. And every single story idea I have, every single painting I make, every single one of them makes me feel so much more understood. And I don't mean to other people, I mean to myself. I figure out who I am bit by bit, and that's been really powerful. And I hope in time I can affect other people in the same way it affects me. At the time, I had a friend I was working with. We got on really, really, really well. And one day she said to me, hey, your home life is shit. Why are you still there? Just come and live with me. And I was amazed. I was like, oh my God, I finally have a ticket out of this hellhole. I can be me, I can have an environment where I can express myself without feeling like I'm gonna run into someone screaming at me, shouting at me, putting me down. So I moved in 2012, just before Christmas, actually. When I moved, I honestly was kind of scared. I'd never been away from that home for long before. And here I was, halfway across the country in a place where, yeah, I knew one person really well, but the other people here, no clue. But they took me in. They became my unofficial adoptive family. And they've shown me so much love and compassion. They've healed so many trust issues I've had. Not only that, but they've made me realize that people can be so much more than hate and vitriol. People can be caring and loving and supportive. And people can hear that you're trans or intersex and not care. That was incredible. I felt like I'd finally open my mouth and talk about who I am, what I feel, what I'm thinking. And it's sad to say, but the first few weeks I was blown away by the fact no one shouted, no one raised their voice, no one slammed doors, no one scolded me. I think that was incredible. So in 2013, I decided to start experimenting with different gender identities. Up until that point, I'd been quite militantly female, and the idea of me being male in any way, shape, or form made me feel so ill. It felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal of everything I'd fought for, and yet I wanted to. I wanted to experiment. So I figured, okay, well, I don't want to be a man. I don't want to be masculine. I know that for a fact, but I kind of want to try male pronouns again. So I did. I had a period of time where I experimented with being a fanboy. I bought a binder, wore it pretty much every day, and yeah, it went pretty well. But I could never really stick with it, is the problem. It always seemed like something was missing. So I'd revert back to female thinking, oh, it's just that. It's just that I'm being the wrong thing. But when I was female, I had the same feelings. So essentially, like ping pong, I went back and forth between these two genders for years, which was extremely confusing. So around this time, my cramps had started up again, which I realized were, well, period cramps. So I went into my new GP and I brought it up and I said, hey, can I finally get some treatment for this? And their response was, well, we don't think that you have an intersex condition because they're so rare. It's the exact same line I heard in my childhood. And for cramps, they said it was all in my head. They didn't believe me. I didn't really know where to go. So I made a nuisance of myself. I kept coming back again and again and again and again until finally eventually they referred me to what's known as an endocrinologist, which is someone who specializes in hormones and hormone disorders. Usually they cover intersex cases too, and almost every intersex person who's being treated by a health service will have at least one endocrinologist assigned to them. So this first endocrinologist I found, he continued the trend of not believing me. I went in, I saw him, he said, "Oh, well, you're trans, right?" So I said, "Well, yeah, I am." He said, "Oh, well, are you sure this isn't just you trying to make me sort of feel more comfortable?" I should have punched him, but I didn't. So we ran some blood tests, and lo and behold, my hormones were not normal. My testosterone was basically non-existent, and my estrogen was low but there. And this was after a few weeks of me not taking medication to get an accurate reading. So yeah, we booked an ultrasound. That went through, and the nurse said she didn't really feel confident enough to say one way or another. I don't really know how someone who's trained to be an ultrasound nurse can't feel confident. The only thing I could think of is perhaps she didn't understand my condition and she didn't know how to respond to what she was looking at. So I go back to the endocrinologist and I say, "Hey, could I get an MRI for a clearer picture so we can actually see what's going on here?" He said, "Well, it's probably just some deviation to the norm, but I'm not going to say you've got an intersex condition because they're so rare." So around 2014, roughly, I want to say, I decided I would be open online about having a DSD because at this point, even though no one was listening to me, I knew what I had. I knew this wasn't normal. And I knew all the people who had said, no, there's no way. I knew they were wrong. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to be open about it and hope one day someone listens to me. And being open about it went pretty well, generally. Almost everyone I met was supportive. Some were curious in an understanding way. They just had never encountered someone who was intersex before. Then I started getting the DMs from people who were a bit too thirsty and viewed an intersex condition as a fetish, which, as you can imagine, made me shut my DMs down pretty quickly. On top of that, I had a boyfriend at the time, and he was a lot more creepy, actually. On our first time meeting up at his house, which was the first time we really had alone time together that wasn't outside, he said, let's just drink a bit, relax. So we did. And I drank way more than I should have. I got very, very drunk. While I was drunk and pretty much passed out on the bed, barely conscious, he was like, "Hey, I want to take a few pictures of you." And I was like, "Okay, is he being kinky or something?" I was like, "Why?" And he's like, I just want him. I just want him. I was like, whatever. Thinking, he just takes some nice, maybe wholesome pictures. Maybe he just takes something generally lewd. And I was like, just don't take any pictures of down there because I'm not comfortable with it. So what did he do? I found out he went ahead and took a bunch of pictures of my junk. And that combined with him being really abusive to my close friend who'd taken me in, I cut off that relationship, and I'm so glad I did. So eventually I got sick of waiting for my local health service to do something about it. And I figured, you know what? I'm just going to go for surgery privately. So I spent pretty much all my money at the time and had to have help from my friend's mother to help pay for it. So I found a surgeon and I went ahead and went through with it. And honestly, immediately following it, I doubted if it was the right thing. I was like, oh my God, should I have done that? Did I feel forced to do that? Have I just essentially gotten rid of a whole bunch of, material I could have used if I wanted to go the other way? Eventually, I figured, you know what? It is the right choice. What I decided was correct because it wasn't about other people. It was about what made me feel comfortable in myself. And ever since having corrective surgery, I've felt great about myself. Granted, it took a very long time to get used to how my junk works now. Originally, I couldn't put anything inside of myself or anything like that. So I was limited to just external. But following the surgery, suddenly I could. And I had no idea what to do. It was so weird. It took me a long time. I'd actually say years before I fully became comfortable with what I had. And early on, I'd have these dreams where I had what I had before, my kind of external mixture. And I'd wake up and go, oh wait, yeah, no, I had surgery. That's so weird. Why do I keep having those dreams? But in the end, it worked out okay. And yeah, I made the right choice. The this takes us to around, I'd say, 2015, 2016. I decided, well, now down there's open, I could finally have periods properly. And all I had outside of me taking hormones specifically for it was the occasional mild breakthrough bleed. So I started self-medding with progesterone. And sure enough, once a month I had a full period. And I figured, okay, you know what? At this point, there is no way these people can deny that I'm intersex. It's unfathomable if anyone could look at such solid evidence and go, nah, don't think so. But lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. I went back to my GP again. I said, hey, I've been having full-on periods. Can you please refer me to a new endocrinologist and do something? His response was, oh, well, I still don't think it's an intersex condition. It could just be something else. But I'll get you an MRI appointment, which is, the big metal magnetic cylinders they put you in, and it spins around and makes a whole bunch of noise. And it kind of creates like a radio image of your body. So I went in, had that done, and very quickly I heard back that, yeah, I have a womb. Gee, who thought, right? That was great. I was like, okay, cool. I have a specialist in MRI who knows absolutely this is a womb, definitely. And I was like, okay, I've had the bleeding as well. There's all the childhood stuff, all of this evidence. Went to my GP and he said, oh, well, it could just be some other cystic structure. I don't understand why some people are so afraid to acknowledge something outside of male and female exists. It's not a hard concept. These people, they just didn't want to acknowledge it. Because if they acknowledge it, that means everything that they think about gender, a huge part of the world for them, is not what they thought. I guess that's scary for some people. Maybe it's fair for it to be scary, but only out of, I'd say, ignorance. If you really look at it, it's not scary. It's just how the world is. And we shouldn't be shutting people's treatment down and treating people like freaks just because they don't fit what we think the world should be. What kind of entitlement makes someone think they can decide what exists and what doesn't? That's some high-level delusion. And to find it among so many doctors, that really concerned me. I eventually managed to convince my GP to refer me to another endocrinologist. She was the first doctor who actually got it. She understood. And her take on it was that the older generation, they don't really want to acknowledge things that make them uncomfortable. They don't want to help people so much as they want to help people in a way they think people should be helped. She was great. She got me on medication through the NHS, so I no longer had to pay for it. She did regular blood test monitoring. It was great. But sadly, due to so many years of trauma and mistrust, I just didn't want to have to go and see my GP for these blood tests. I didn't want to have to go through them, to arrange external things like an MRI again. And I kind of made the foolish decision to say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to go back to self-medding because it's safe, because I don't have to worry about someone putting me down. I don't have to worry about entering a room and, oh, my endocrinologist is being replaced that day with someone who's standing in and they're a total arsehole who could completely destroy my treatment in one instant. And I think that was an extreme reaction, and I definitely went overboard, but I think it's kind of understandable given what I'd had to deal with up until that point. Another thing that contributed to that trauma was when I was invited to my mother's wedding. She'd gotten married again, and I didn't really want to go. We weren't on great terms, but we were still in contact. But, I figured, okay, I can just do this and, hopefully never get called on to do anything again. So I show up and she's like, hey, is it okay if you film everything? Because I know you're good with technology. And I was like, yeah, whatever, that's fine. So I go around recording this wedding, seeing what everyone's up to, getting decent angles, usual. And then came the after party. And my mother sat down and she, read out a list of thank you and special thanks, that kind of thing. And she mentioned so many people. She mentioned everyone, including my brother and sister, but she didn't mention me. And then I realized that's why she wanted me to have the camera, so I wasn't in her wedding. And that was really the last straw. I just realized this woman doesn't care about me. I'm an embarrassment to her. I'm a freak that she lied to for my entire life. That's what I am to her. And she's never gonna love me. She's never gonna care. She's never gonna be there for me. And that's when I made the decision to cut off contact with my biological family completely. And I haven't talked to them in probably about 6 years now. You know what? One of the best decisions I ever made. This brings me to around the next major development, which was in 2018. I started dating my current boyfriend, and it was incredible having someone so close to me. He was so supportive, and, he really just wanted to hear me out. He wanted to know, all that stuff, just talk about it if you want to. And when it comes to gender, whatever you want to do, just talk about it. And it was, I think, shortly after this, I started playing a whole bunch of Breath of the Wild. And obviously, Link is kind of a feminine guy. So I was like, you know what? This makes me feel comfortable in the same way I felt comfortable as a kid with playing female characters. There's got to be a reason I keep coming back to fanboy. But then there has to be a reason why I keep going back to girl. And I just had no clue. And that's when I realized, oh, it's probably not that I'm one or the other. It's probably that I'm non-binary and I'm both. And hey, that makes sense. That's how I am physically. So that's what I started rolling with. And that helped a lot. But it took me a long time to really be open about that fully and fully embrace it, a few years. So around the middle of 2019, I finally got around to rejoining the NHS. It wasn't like I decided one day, hey, I'll go and see an endocrinologist again. No, it was instead that I had a very tough time. That friend I mentioned earlier, my childhood friend I was very close with, I learned he'd committed suicide in 2018. And that hurt because I felt conflicted. He was so close to me, but he treated me badly at times. And I think the worst thing is I felt like I could have done something. I knew he was depressed. But when I cut off contact with my family, I cut off contact with everyone from my old life. And that included him. I know he probably would have done it anyway, but I felt like in some way it was my fault. Maybe if I was still around, he would have had another few years. Maybe I could have saved him. I don't know. But it got me thinking about my childhood again. All of those memories of abuse and cruelty came flooding back to me, and I had a mental breakdown. And I attempted suicide myself. And I ended up being taken to hospital, a psychiatric hospital. When I was there, I underwent a decent amount of therapy for PTSD, which helped me a lot, actually. And I also got back in contact with my old endocrinologist because, well, on my file, there was still my hormones. So when it came to giving me my medication at the hospital, they were like, hey, we can give you your hormones if you want. So I said, yeah, sure, okay. Now, I don't know if it was related to the hormones or not, the change from what I was self-medding with to what I was given. But I had one of the worst periods of my life in that hospital. And wow, it made me realize, you know what? I probably do need an endocrinologist, because if I don't get my medication balanced, I'm going to be going through a lot of hell and pain. So I said, you know what? Fine. I'll get back in contact with my endocrinologist. And I did. And it was nice. It was nice seeing her again. And it was also nice, actually, being able to express my non-binary identity. Even though I wasn't fully, certain I was non-binary at the time. When I went into hospital, I was asked, hey, what do you identify as? And I said, well, I'm not 100% sure, but I think non-binary is probably the closest. And one of the really good things about the UK is if you identify as female, male, whatever you identify as, you can go to that ward, no questions asked. No one wants to see any documentation. No one grills you for 20 hours. It's just, okay, you identify as this, go here. Because I identified as non-binary, they said, hey, which ward do you want to go on? Do you want to go on the male ward, the female ward? So I decided, okay, I'll go on the female ward, because, I don't know, just felt like a more me environment, given I'm so, feminine. That's kind of the core of my gender. So, yeah. So when I returned to my endocrinologist, I said, hey, the MRI that I had done, you kind of said that you supported that and you acknowledge it. Is that still the case? And she said, yeah, absolutely. The MRI you showed me, the MRI you had done rather, completely and utterly, 100%, you've got a womb. I want to make sure that you get the right treatment, that you get access to the right services, everything. And she said, I think you have a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Now, what that means is congenital genital obviously means from birth. Adrenal refers to the adrenal glands, which produce a whole bunch of hormones like adrenaline, but also androgens like testosterone. And hyperplasia refers to it being bigger and more active than normal. So she thought that, I had XX chromosomes and my adrenal glands were just a bit big and they'd caused my DSD. And I figured, okay, but what about the blood test I had done a few years ago that showed I had very low testosterone? Surely that can't be the case if it's congenital adrenal hyperplasia. But she said, okay, I'm pretty sure it's congenital adrenal hyperplasia, but if you want, we could do a karyotype. I'm pretty sure it'll come back XX though. So I said, okay, let's do a karyotype. A karyotype, by the way, is a process in which a blood sample is taken and they assess what your karyotype is, if you've got XX chromosomes or XY. So I get a letter saying, hey, we've actually found you have XY chromosomes. And that's kind of a big deal because I have a womb. Now, most people who have XY chromosomes will develop their gonads as primarily testicles. And testicles release a hormone that prevents the development of a womb. So me having XY suggests that, oh, there's something up with my gonads, my ovaries, testicles, who knows what. So they referred me to the sort of highest specialists in the country, and I started attending their clinic. So when I finally met the disorder of sex development team, we sat down and I was interviewed by 5 complete strangers about very personal things, including, what my genitals looked like, how they functioned, what my sex life is like, a complete history of my experiences with gender and, sex characteristics. But they all listened to me and acknowledged me, and they said, you've done a really good job pointing this out. So many people who come to see us, their GPs turn them away again and again and again. You did the right thing by pushing through that, because you know what? A doctor isn't always right. Sometimes they're wrong. And it just takes finding the evidence and presenting it with enough persistence to eventually get seen by who you need to be seen by. And yeah, they're right. My DST team were so kind to me. And it's fantastic having a resource like that where I have people I can talk to and reach out to and say, hey, I'm wondering about this, like this symptom. Do you think we could look at this path? And that's how we handled my condition. They essentially trusted me to direct the course of treatment. They said, hey, you've done a lot of research on this. You know your own body better than anyone else. You talk to us and we'll work together and we'll go down different routes. So I said, okay, well, I think first things first is let's, repeat the karyotype, see what it comes out as, just in case. And yeah, XY as we figured. And we went through a whole bunch of different things, ruling out condition after condition. Eventually, we settled on the diagnosis of what's called gonadal dysgenesis. Gonadal referring to gonads, ovaries, testicles, and dysgenesis meaning failure to develop or a incorrect development. So essentially, my ovaries/testicles hadn't developed properly. And we think that that's because they developed as what's known as streak gonads, where the tissue is a mixture of ovary and testicle, which is why I have both a prostate and a womb, and why I had the particular manifestation of deformity that I did, and why I progressed through primarily just female puberty when left to it. As for a probable cause of the condition, there isn't really much found to be a cause. There's no specific genetic condition that always causes it, and most people with a condition, there hasn't been a genetic cause pinned to it. But me and my endocrinologist and my genealogist, we've come to the conclusion that it might be caused by a condition known as tetragrammatic chimerism, which basically means in the womb you had 2 twins, one with XX, one with XY, and they sort of fused into one person, which is a cause of gonadal dysgenesis. Sadly, we can't completely verify that yet as the cause of my gonadal dysgenesis because, well, all of the lab space is taken up with COVID right now, which I understand, and I'm happy to wait. Also, on the line of tetragrammatic chimerism, that's suspected as the cause of a few other conditions I have, such as I'm missing my lateral incisors, which are the 2 sort of teeth either side of the big teeth, but my jaw's kind of moved everything in so you can't really tell. Another thing is I have a condition called ocular cutaneous albinism type 4, which is a form of albino, which means my skin and eyes are extremely pale. My eyes are blue when they should be brown. My skin skin is extremely pale beige, but my hair's unaffected. It's quite dark brown black, and that took a long time to find out. But now I have a potential cause of that too. So it's all like putting these pieces together to figure out all these different strands of my life, to try and figure out, hey, what caused this? What caused this? And, do I have anything to be worried about? Thankfully, the only thing that I really have to be worried about now is if there's any gonadal tissue left in me, because sadly, with intersex conditions, there tends to be high rates of cancer, gonadal cancer, and it wasn't fully confirmed if everything had been removed in terms of gonadal tissue. So I'm going to have a follow-up MRI in the next 6 months' time to check and make sure everything's out. Outside of that, though, I'm pretty safe now, and that's thanks to my DSD team. They've put me on what's called a combo pill, which I mentioned earlier. It makes sure that I have periods on time, basically, while also preventing bone loss and that kind of thing. And I just have to take that every day forever. It's only one pill, so I don't mind too much. So I suppose the final development in the story is I finally fully realized, hey, yeah, I'm non-binary. And, much like my body, I'm male and female. And that's cool. I'm definitely femme and I'm comfortable in that. And ever since meeting so many non-binary friends and hearing their experiences and having them tell me what my experience has been like and the similarities to theirs, yeah, that's made me comfortable, and I feel like I finally know who I am gender-wise. It might be a bit out of the ordinary, but I am anyway, so it all works out in the end. So as I previously mentioned, professionally I'm an artist, and I started out in a freelance 3D space, but I've actually moved into the graphic novel space recently, and I recently, at the time of recording, finished my first ever graphic novel storyboard. And through those novels, I'm hoping to explore concepts of PTSD and trauma, because that's the best way I've found to get that out of me. And I really hope that not only covering those topics, but also covering being intersexed. And hey, who knows? A lot of people have said I should maybe write about my life someday, so maybe I will. I just want my art to reach people, and I want it to give them the escape that I had as a kid, the thing that kept me going. And I want it to inspire them and make them realize that the world is so much bigger than they thought it was. I want to expand people's view of what human being is. I want people to see the world for how it really is. That's what matters to me. And doing art is honestly the best job I could ever ask for. If you want to see any of my stuff, I post updates about novels on my Twitter, and also my ArtStation has my complete collection. I'm sure there's like a link down there or here or wherever. So I'd really appreciate it if you check out. And yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end of this. I'm going to be doing a AMA on the Discord server shortly following this coming out. No exact date yet, but just keep your eyes on the server and I'll answer your questions. And I suppose the very last thing I want to say is, if you're intersex, it's okay. You're not weird, you're not defective, you're not a freak. You're just different. And you're different in a way that people have been different since human beings started existing. Your own person, physically, mentally, entirely. You can identify as whatever makes you feel comfortable, because at the end of the day, that's what you are. You're just you. Whatever's comfortable is who you are, and you should embrace that. Not only should you embrace that, but know that if you've got an intersex condition, it might feel like people ignore you, they disregard you, they don't listen to you, they want to pretend you don't exist. Just keep pushing. That's all you have to do. Just keep pushing forwards. And if you can do that with enough persistence, you'll probably get through to someone worthwhile eventually. And believe me, when you do, it helps so much. So I hope this has helped at least someone. And yeah, thank you for listening. And I hope I've helped.